Dear colleagues and friends, the title of my report is What's to be done with pseudo-democracies, the case of Azerbaijan. For example of Azerbaijan, I'm going to consider the political regimes that have declared themselves democracies, those which have on paper all the democratic institutions, but which do not in fact wish to have any of them implemented in real life. Such regimes which provide for their citizens certain rights, for example personal rights, but refuse to grant them civil and political ones, have been previously studied in political science. For example, Professor Larry Diamond calls them hybrid regimes. Other terms to characterize those regimes, such as semi, quasi, and pseudo-authoritarian, also exist. But I believe that pseudo-democracy is the most appropriate definition for this phenomenon, because this title more precisely captures the essence of such regimes, specifically their hypocritical and deliberately imitational character. I would note that my research on the example of Azerbaijan concerns namely the not free countries in the Freedom House classification. And some of my recommendations do not apply to partly free countries, such as, let's say, Georgia or Tanzania. In this report, I will briefly give description on the following. See on the slide. It is a state of democracy and autocracy in the world, the situation of Azerbaijan as a not free country, agenda for Azerbaijani Democrats, agenda for outside supporters of liberal reforms, the image problem of democratic countries, and agenda for civil activists of Western countries in support of reforms. Let's say chapter first, the state of democracy and autocracy in the world. Attending various conferences here in Washington, D.C., I have heard the notion that it is time to reduce Western aid for democracy in the world because the European Union and the United States are now experiencing serious economic crisis and foreign policy challenges. And of course, democracy cannot be imposed from the outside and built overnight. I believe this view is pessimistic and unfounded. First of all, as if it didn't look paradoxical, we can count on our fingers the number of countries that have set up democratic regimes by themselves. The rest of the democracies were established with support from the outside. Let's recall the downfall of feudalism in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars, the spread of democracy around the world after the World War II or Cold War. We can also recall the assistance of France in struggle of the American people for independence and democracy. Therefore, I conclude democracy almost never emerged only as a result of internal development. And today, in my opinion, the situation in the world is much more favorable for the spread of democracy than it was during the Cold War. In the next 15, 20 years, the world has a very good chance to getting rid of authoritarian regimes for good. Today, there are no more powerful anti-democratic camps. Democracy is regarded as the only legitimate political system worldwide. Governmental control over communications is lost. Moral power and the control of authoritarian regimes over the spiritual sphere of the individual are lost. Cruelty is retreating around the world. The abolition of death penalty is spreading to more and more states. A man that insulting the dictator before could be cruelly killed, but now he can get just 2 or 3 years in prison. That's what happened in my country. Attitude toward women and minorities are changing for better. Even animal rights are on the agenda now, and a couple of months ago, bullfights were banned in Barcelona. Imperceptibly for us, the spirit of times, Zeitgeist, is positively changing. The number of free countries in the 20th century increased tenfold, and today we are witnessing such a momentous event as Arab Spring. We see the winds of change in Russia, Iran, and Burma. In all of that, I see a serious reason to be optimistic. I have an unbearable feeling And this is my message, that Fukuyama's end of history is near. Chapter 2, Situation in Azerbaijan as a not-free country. On paper, we in Azerbaijan have all the democratic institutions, elections, separation of power, constitutional rights, etc. But in reality, none of this actually exists, which is just as it was in the former Soviet Union. Today, Azerbaijan is in a situation I call back in the USSR. All civil and political rights in the country are repressed. The country has about 70 political prisoners, 16 prisoners of conscience, according to Amnesty International, and about 240 religious activists arrested. Demonstrations and rallies being banned. Like-minded person cannot meet even indoors. The social status of political parties is very much reminiscent of dissident clubs, having only moral power over people's minds, as it was in the former USSR. Unfortunately, parties, dissident clubs, try to continue to behave like real political parties, and society helplessly continue to rely on them, demanding that they, without the participation of people, should save the people. And notably, economic activity is controlled by regime, and almost every store has a portrait of the president family hanging on the wall. Social protests are suppressed by oil money. Thus, in our pseudo-democracy, we only have such democratic resources as, see slide please, dissident clubs, youth organizations operating almost underground, human rights defense organizations operating under high pressure, pro-democratic religious activists, just one real independent newspaper, Azadlik, and one independent news agency to run. Democratic organizations in Azerbaijan, Azerbaijani diaspora through the democratic countries. It's also our resource. Relatively free internet access to which our people have emigrated in search of self-expression and self-organization. Radio Liberty Azerbaijani service is very active and very popular here. Widespread satellite TV programs from the West, Turkey, and Russia. That is our small resources of democracy. Thus, the ruling regime of our pseudo-democracy has two goals. First, to establish an anti-democratic regime to the fullest. Second, submit it to the West as a democratic regime. And pseudo-democracies spend a huge amount of money for this mimicry. I try to estimate how much such mimicry costs per year. Please see. The budget of pseudo-parliament, pseudo-elections, pseudo-central electoral commission, pseudo-ombudsman, pseudo-everything. So totally $40 million a year. That is for democratic cosmetics. I believe other countries, like Azerbaijan, do the same. Same procedures to same cosmetics. Chapter 3, Agenda for Azerbaijani Democrats, Political and Civil Activists. For Democrats in not free countries, the main task is to keep the flame burning, and by their own example to awaken people and help them to defeat the fear imposed by repression. In a not free country, a democratic politician transforms into a democrat dissident, like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia. When the intimidated society is not able to support you as a real political party, then you must behave according to your actual social status, the status of a dissident, not a status of politician. If you do not have material strength, you should think about your moral strength. The democrat dissident has to become a moral example for the people. He should become a pure democratic crystal particle which is capable of triggering the reign of democracy. Democrat dissidents should also develop new forms of nonviolent protest. To acting Democrats in pseudo-democracy, there is no longer need for morally suspicious political coalitions and maneuvering. No need to compete for domination among your peers. It's better to be alone, but pure like crystal, and the people will listen to you. Democrats should spread the idea that if a man in a not free country cannot explicitly protest, then he should at least stay away from the lies surrounding him. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote in his appeal to the Soviet people, live not by lies. Civil activists that are still standing should establish contacts with each other and with civil activists abroad. And they should also support any democratic social network, support any citizen initiative, endorse non-conformism in society, spread hope among people that the end of history is near, and they had better learn to fight without any hope. Chapter 4. Agenda for outside supporters of reforms. I would also like to answer the question, why should democratic countries help struggling people when things at home are not going well? Which I often meet here with this question. We have to help them for humanism and solidarity, for soft security as in terms of Helsinki process, to create new developed markets, to prevent the sudden explosions of civil unrest, harmful not only for the suffering country, but for global situation as well. To build a rational and friendly community of nations in order to confront the global resource crisis. This crisis is expected to come in the next 30 years. Now, if someone prefers to speak about foreign aid to democracy in terms of profits, then we can consider this aid as long-term investment. How to help them? As was mentioned previously, providing assistance toward liberal reforms today is far easier than it was during the Cold War. Authoritarianism in the world is as weak as it has ever been in history. The thrones of dictators are shattering. As you can see in this slide, with the last dictators' portraits, very few of them remain. Yes. Sanctions. Sanctions. The international democratic community has many types of sanctions against oppressive regimes, and their efficacy continues to be debated. Should sanctions be imposed rather than a policy of constructive engagement? In my opinion, if constructive engagement doesn't work, then there is no need to hesitate with sanctions. Some observers argue that sanctions do not help. I do not agree with that. I would say the sanctions do not help immediately. Sanctions, statements of protest, and acts of solidarity, the broadcasting of radio liberty, the internet, and other liberation technologies, these have a cumulative effect. Today, many observers still cannot figure out how Arab Spring happened. It is obvious that this phenomenon is a cumulative result of the all-encompassing influence of the world's democracy and liberation technologies on the society of Arab countries. Foreign aid. Sometimes democratic countries spend millions of dollars to support democratic institutions which do not exist in pseudo-democracy at all. Millions of dollars and euros are spent to develop non-existing independent judiciary, ombudsman, public television, not to mention some police training for the delicate handling of demonstrators. The European Union usually provides this type of programs to Azerbaijan. It is understandable that this spending was done in order to enter the country. We understand that. But isn't it possible, along with police training, to provide assistance to civil society, help to those who are keeping the flame burning? For example, to launch satellite TV for Voice of America or Radio Liberty in Azerbaijani or, I don't know, Belarus language. To that end, only 500,000 per year is needed. Not that impressive figure. And that would be a real help for our democracy. One of the most effective foreign aid programs is Education USA or Education in Europe for our youth. The program has already educated some 2,000 students from Azerbaijan in United States and European universities. Many of them are now strong supporters of liberal reforms in the country. It is obvious that these programs should be further developed and expanded. Legal dimension. The arbitrariness of dictatorship occurs as if in a legal vacuum. While violating the rights of citizens and spreading corruption, they themselves feel safe under the protection of national sovereignty. I am the king of the castle, and all I do is right, as they say. So the international community must constantly remind these kings and sultans that their acts to establish a corrupt dictatorship fall under the criminal penalty for illegal seizure of power with the aim of self-enrichment. They must constantly be reminded of this provision. Let them see this provision even in their sleep. Moral dimension. Fight against the new slavery. The rejection of dictatorship by the international community must be raised to the same high moral level as the rejection of slavery in the early 19th century. Dictatorship may be seen as a new kind of slavery. The new slavery today, it is a shame. It is a sin and a crime, just as traditional slavery was in human history. To have such kind of slavery today is unacceptable, even if the modern slaves, the people of dictatorship, do not openly protest against it. For that, see international covenants on human rights, let's say European Convention on Human Rights, no one shall be held in slavery, and United Nations documents on organized crime and trafficking. The concept of victims of trafficking in person shall be irrelevant. Even if they're silent, we can write this question. Chapter 5, the image problem of democratic country. The positive image of democratic countries is an example for the ultimate goal of liberal reforms, is an important tool in the struggle for democracy in the world. After the end of the Cold War, this image was quite positive in countries like Azerbaijan. But unfortunately today, it leaves a lot to be desired. Our think tank, the Far Center, carried out a national opinion poll last year among Azerbaijani youth in August, and found that 42% of the respondents prefer the Western model of development. Please see the slide. However, only 5.4% of respondents named the United States among countries friendly to Azerbaijan. This happened, in my opinion, for two reasons. Firstly, because of the Western policy of double standards towards the democratic struggle in the world and in Azerbaijan in particular. And secondly, this disdain mainly occurs as a result of an error in public's mentality, which, in my opinion, was formed over 10,000 years long history of civilization. This opinion states that conquest and robbery is the absolute law of human and international relations, that it is a zero-sum game. One can become rich only through continuing looting or cheating of the weak ones. But in the late Yes, everything is okay. But in the late 19th century, it became clear that the zero-sum game doesn't work. By reducing the role of resources in the producing of goods, by division of labor, and by the free market, a new law was imposed, the positive-sum game, or win-win game law, where both sides benefit as a result of interaction. This new law should be especially and constantly explained to people in the world and in the United States, because the zero-sum game dominates their minds at 10,000 years, but the positive-sum game has only had 100 years of history. The law of positive-sum game should be constantly explained to the public, because today this law, and not the zero-sum game, is indeed a source of US foreign policy. Provisions of the positive-sum game are as follows. Collaboration today brings much more money than robbery. We help you because if you prosper, then we will prosper as well. We want you to develop and become rich in order to be able to buy our X-ray machines. As a contribution to the campaign mentioned above here, see slide, a comic diagram which I have made to illustrate the results of Western policy, which is often called a policy of double standard. We see for last 5 years, this is support of democracy, sometimes support of autocracy, and it's going like that. According to United States interests. In the diagram, one can see that results of US policy over the short term, with the support sometimes for democracy and sometimes for autocracy, depending on US interests. But the key here is that US interests have changed from the zero to the positive-sum game. The US now will only prosper if the world prospers as well. Please, next slide. And the second diagram shows the long-term results of 400 years of such policy. The same you see supporting autocracy, democracy, autocracy, but as you can see, a result of this policy of double standards, the number of democratic countries in the last 100 years has increased 10 times. With this diagram, which I first drew on a napkin in some restaurant, I was able to convince my companions that the positive-sum game exists, and that a result of Western foreign policy, freedom in the world is expanding. Oh, sorry, I did, no. Then 6, agenda for civil society of the Western countries, people against the new kind of slavery. People under dictatorship would be very grateful if civic activists of democratic countries would pay more attention to their pain. After all, if you care for a freezing dolphin in the Arctic ice, or for a trapped deer, look at us, we also fell into a trap and also freeze in our prisons. We encourage you to join in the fight against the new slavery, perhaps the last slavery on the earth. The moral pressure of NGOs, celebrities, and public figures can soften planned acts of repression, and sometimes even save lives. Authoritarian leaders, no matter how omnipotent they are usually thin-skinned and vulnerable persons. Dictators need not only obedience and money, but also respect and admiration. And we must convince Western leaders not to glorify them, but to treat them according to their unjust deeds. Whenever you meet a dictator, try to remind him of what he was done to his citizens. And if dictators should say that you are interfering in the internal affairs of his country, then show him the international human rights covenants he has signed, in which he agreed that he will respect the rights of persons to observe and promote the implementation of such a covenant. Please see this slide. This is signed by Azerbaijan concluding documents of Vienna meeting of CSC. So if some Azerbaijani officials will say that you interfere, you sign this, please. Belarus also signed this. I'm glad to inform you that the campaign in which celebrities come out against the new slavery has been started as an initiative of Human Rights Watch. The campaign, entitled Sing for Democracy, appeals to famous artists to refuse to sing for dictators, even for a huge payoff. Sting has already responded to this appeal and refused to participate in a concert dedicated to the jubilee of the Kazakh president Nazarbayev. And we welcome Sting, who continued in the noble tradition of great European musicians such as Beethoven, Grieg, and of course the Beatles, who refused to support injustice using their power of their music. And here is a shot from the famous Beatles movie, Yellow Submarine, where the Beatles freed the country of Pepperland from authoritarianism with their music. By the way, that was exactly what Beatles' song did with USSR. Exactly Beatles' song and rock and roll crashed USSR. But this is my maybe next presentation. Along with celebrities, we can find a lot of civic groups, movements, and public figures that could be involved in the campaign against the new slavery. Anti-globalists, religious Democrats, all kinds of moral movements, environmental movements, and many others could be supportive. The participation in such campaign could bring great moral satisfaction to civil activists, especially since the results of their activities will manifest very soon, because Fukuyama's end of history is near. Thank you, dear friends, for your patience. That's all I want to say. In conclusion, I want to go back to the title of the presentation, What's to be Done?, which refers to famous revolutionary manifestos well known in the former Soviet Union and communist bloc, such as Nikolai Chernyshevsky. Maybe someone knows of political scientists, but in former Soviet Union, everybody knows him. He was like Stormbringer and writes some left revolutionary manifesto. Next person who refers to this was Lenin. What's to be done? It is famous also, concrete program of revolution, that first, second, third, so he wrote how to do that. And then the next slide is what's to be done with pseudo-democracy. So, dear friends, thank you for coming and for your patience. I just want to say thank to my colleagues, to our assistant Sarah Boucher and our directors Sally Blair, who assist me to the fullest and work with me like perfectionists on this paper. Thank you.